OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about meaningful and metaphoric tendencies, prisms and prisons of thought. There's a number of philosophers who have written on the issue of metaphors and how metaphors are much deeper than just poetic devices. Susan Sontag, I.A. Richards, George Lakoff, Douglas Hofstadter. And often we get the impression from education that metaphors are poetic devices. They're just sort of decorations. They're flares of language and not much more. But what's really critical to realize is that metaphors are almost organs of thought. They're so essential to thinking and so much control thinking that one wants to place them at a foundational level of thinking, not merely decoration. And a book I really like, The End of Education by Neil Postman, who's famous for his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, but I'm a big fan of his education work. And he explains this class that I.A. Richards would do, this experiment. And I.A. Richards was another famous thinker. And he would ask his class, he'd break it up into like 3 groups, and he would ask his class to write a philosophy of education. But one group he would give them a starting sentence. For one group he'd say, education is a tree, another education is a river, and another person something like education is a garden. And the point that Neil Postman talks about that Richards was so big on is that literally the educational philosophies that people came up with reflected the metaphor. They were massively influenced by the metaphor and were a reflection of it. And Neil Postman even points out someone like Rousseau, whose idea that plants are improved by cultivation and man by education, linking together this comparison of plants and children. Neil Postman points out that Rousseau's entire philosophy emerges out of that. And I.A. Richards sees something very similar in this classroom experiment, because there's no necessary reason why the group should have given rise to educational philosophies of which reflected the metaphors so strongly, and yet they did. And so what Postman gets very concerned about is the fact that education today treats metaphor as if merely a decoration. It doesn't appreciate its profoundly formulative and influential power over ideas. We make our metaphors and then our metaphors make us, per se. That old line, Marshall McLuhan love, we make our tools and then our tools make us. If we don't appreciate how much metaphors shape us, then we're just going to use metaphors carelessly. We're not going to think much of it, and they're going to end up shaping us in ways we can't even comprehend. Neil Postman basically wants us to really, in education, focus on metaphors and the way that it shapes our thinking, to really make a point to learn the art of metaphors. And we all have examples. I think we can all think of examples where we've heard a complicated idea, something that really struck us, and it didn't really quite click, though, until there was a metaphor for it. And then we went, oh, and then we understood it. Now, this is also problematic because that means people could come up with metaphors that are really nice, and we could think the idea is good because the metaphor is good. And so we could be deceived and tricked by metaphor into falling into a way of thinking that's not good simply because we're lured in by the metaphor. Just because there's a good metaphor does not mean that there is necessarily a truth. But if we don't understand the power of metaphor, if we don't understand how influential it is and how much our brain craves it to understand it, the world around us, then we're going to fall victim to poor metaphors. We're going to fall victim to deceptions of metaphor. So metaphors are like fire. I always love that example. It's something that can keep us alive, but also burn us alive. We just have to learn how to use it. And what Postman writes, he says, a metaphor is not an ornament. It is an organ of perception. And if we really get that and take that seriously, it's a big deal. The other thing that metaphors do is, if we take someone like Einstein, who was so gifted at metaphor, I think he talks about general relativity. He explains in terms of, a guy falling in a glass-made elevator through space. And he uses all these images that, had Einstein not been so gifted at images, it's hard to imagine his thinking spreading and having much influence outside of his field. So metaphors also give us the ability to escape specialization, to spread our ideas. Einstein's had a big effect on literature, on sociology, on lots of trains of thought. But without the metaphors, if we would have had no images, no nothing, just the formulas, just the mathematics or the physical explanations, Einstein would have had a much less impact, and probably the evolution of thought across the entire human race would be much slower. And I think we can just, expand that thought to all thinkers in general, Nikola Tesla, some of the great ideas, Kurt Gödel, etc., and so forth. So metaphor is very, very important. The other thing the paper discusses is how we have a natural hunger for explanation. So we have a hunger for metaphor that we have to control, or it's going to get the best for us. And we also have a hunger for explanation. If I see a cup sitting on a table, then there's a reason it's there. Like, by definition, if things are where they are, there must be an explanation for why they're there. If a rock is on the shore, on the seashore, there must be a reason it's there. So to see a thing is to see something that must be backed by an explanation. Now, critically, the explanation might just be randomness. The rock is on the seashore because the ocean, a wave put it there, or a person dropped it there randomly. But it's critical to realize that randomness is in fact an explanation. We may not like the explanation. We may want to hear that, someone put the rock there as an art exhibit, or we may want more intention. But randomness, chance, coincidence, so on and so forth are very valid explanations. But we tend to have a bias in favor of more, one almost wants to say, vivid or tangible explanations. If there's a cup on the table and we see it and we ask, why is that cup there? If somebody says, I don't know, I just put it there. That's not very satisfying. We want a sense of intention. And there's reason to think there might be a sense of intention. Here's the funny thing. If the cup is on the table, the phenomenological experience of the cup on the table would be the same if someone put it there with radical intention and if someone put it there with no intention at all. So we have this kind of Schrodinger's cat, this kind of open canvas space where it could be either or. And the point is that we have a natural disposition to assume high intention. There must be an explanation for why the cup is there, but the explanation doesn't necessarily have to be super complex. It could just be serendipitous or random. The reason this is important is because if we don't learn to control our tendency to not accept coincidence as an explanation and our hunger for explanation, then if something bad happens, something that's just a result of randomness, say our friend is in a car wreck, where our desire for explanation could go into overdrive, and we'll say, it's because the manufacturer of the car was careless. The other guy on the road was careless. Because the city government didn't care about potholes. Or we'll say, it's because our friend is a bad driver. We will naturally not make space for simply the explanation that it was an accident. It was an accident is so unsatisfying. We tend to want more, but if we want more and we blame potholes, then we may petition our government to spend, $50 million on filling all the potholes in the road, and it won't make a difference because there's always going to be some space for human error. So we really need a category. We really need to understand that randomness is an explanation. Coincidence is an explanation, even if we don't like it. So we need to understand that metaphors are organs of perception and we need to understand that so that we control it, so that our natural hunger for metaphor, because I think, the issue is, like what I.A. Richards is trying to show, is that when we're presented with a metaphor, we latch onto it. We just grab it and let it shape our thinking in ways that we don't even appreciate it. So likewise, our natural hunger for explanation just grabs us. It controls us, and it will control our actions without us even realizing it, because we can't accept coincidence. And so our hunger for explanation goes into overdrive, and there's no telling where we'll end up. We can end up in some very problematic places. The work of O.G. Rose, talks about pitch and risks, conspiracies, all these different things. If we don't learn to control the natural hunger for explanation, we can find ourselves in conspiracies every day of the week, or things that can't be solved, and this can lead to radical existential anxiety and trouble. Now, this paper is not arguing that metaphors don't matter, that there is no truth to metaphors, there's no truth to explanation, that ultimately nihilism is true. That's not what we're saying at all. We're talking about how we all as human beings have natural tendencies toward metaphors and meaning, explanation, and that if we don't learn to cultivate these tendencies, they're going to control us rather than us shape our meaning and metaphors. Our metaphors and meaning will shape us. So it's very important to own these tendencies, to cultivate them, and to be aware of them. So anyway, this has been O.G. Rose. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.